Okay. Whew, all right. So this is a big topic, and I've started from the basis that I know some of you know a lot and some of you don't know very much. I think sometimes it's good to go back to the basics and just get a sense of not just what it is, but where it sits in our legislative framework. And so the legal geek in me, as I was doing this, I went, where in the Act does it actually say that? And where in the regulation? And so I am kind of going to be quoting some of that for those of you that want to have a look. But the aim is I'm going to give you a practical understanding of psychosocial hazards, a couple of tools. So we've got a couple of handouts we're going to send to you after today that we hope that you can start to use in your workplace, and a couple of things to be aware of, I guess, in terms of how it's currently playing out in workplaces. So the definition on the screen, that is actually the definition. So I was like, where does that definition come from? So it comes from section 55B of the Work Health and Safety Regulations. And I actually did a screenshot of the regulations so that you can see. Actually defines psychosocial hazards really simply. It's stuff in your environment that can result in psychological harm. So don't you love a lawyer who comes up with the legal term stuff in your environment? But that's a really simple way of thinking about it. Now they've defined it, they're talking about your work systems, your environment. So some of it is structural, related to environment. Some of it is inherent in the job. So something like isolated work situations. Some of it has to do with interactions between people. But the glue that brings that definition together is that it may cause psychological harm. It can also cause physical harm, but the reason why it's been coined as psychosocial hazard is because it can cause psychological harm. So that's our starting point. Now, I may have people from interstate. I am going to be quoting WA legislation throughout this time. There are some other, you can kind of find equivalents in other states for some of it, and I will show you a map in a minute just to get a sense of what's happened in Australia in this space. So that's our starting definition. And we have this distinction between a psychosocial hazard and a psychosocial risk. So just so we're clear about that distinction, section 55B basically says a risk is a risk to the health or safety of a worker which is arisen from a psychosocial hazard. So a hazard can create a potential risk. And so when we look at how they language it, they usually generally language it as a psychosocial hazard that can relate to a psychosocial risk. So that's our definition. I want to just give you a sense of what's been happening in Australia in this space in the last couple of years, because even though this language has been around longer than the last couple of years, and I remember working with a client that probably would have been at least 6 years ago, where they were investigated by WorkSafe. WorkSafe came in and did an investigation. As many of you know, WorkSafe is the governing body around safety issues in WA. They investigated this workplace, and from that, they issued improvement notices. And in the improvement notices, they articulated that there were some psychosocial risks. I remember back then going, what does that even mean? I hadn't really heard of it that much. And so really what we see, the wave of what's happened in the last couple of years is some clearer languaging and frameworks around it. And so if we have a look what's happened in Australia, I'm literally just going to bring up for you all of the different codes. We'll go back, all of the different codes and regulations that have popped up all over Australia, literally in the last 2 years. And actually, the only state left that's kind of we're waiting on is Victoria. And they've been in discussion. They've just been in discussion for quite a while. It's been like a year and a half at least. So I'm not quite sure what they're still talking about. But if you look up on that slide, we have a lot of action. And I've got to say, I think that is a good thing because, like I said, WorkSafe was using the language of psychosocial hazards and risks 6-7 years ago, but our understanding related to it probably was pretty limited. Now in WA, we really do have the benefit in our regulations, and we now have a code of practice just on psychosocial hazards in the workplace. So actually, I see that as a really good thing. So some of you in the room have obviously worked with me in the past, and up until recently, I've talked about these 3 circles of behaviour. And with me re-looking at psychosocial hazards last year when we launched our new play on psychosocial hazards, I decided that it was time to create 4 circles of behaviour. So I want to explain to you how I think all of these behaviours about how people treat each other interact with each other. So the first circle, which you would have heard of previously, is the one related to unlawful. So that's where we have a specific piece of legislation, and it's particularly related to how people treat each other. So that's where we have sexual harassment, discrimination, bullying, violence and aggression, unresolved conflict. So all of those behaviours, which historically, if you've worked with me, we've run workshops on that space. Fits within the first circle. So that's all of what we call our civil laws, which are related to workplaces and how people treat each other. We also have in unlawful behaviours criminal laws, so really simple distinction between criminal and civil. Criminal laws can happen anywhere, whereas the stuff I just mentioned before is more related to the workplace or a workplace connection. So I can walk down the street, and if somebody whistles at me and shouts out "nice ass," that is not sexual harassment, right? Because it's sexual harassment's narrower. But if I go into someone's workplaces as a contractor or a consultant and someone does that behaviour to me, that would be sexual harassment. In contrast, a criminal law, so something like indecent assault. Indecent assault is when someone touches the sexual parts of somebody's body. Whether that happens in the workplace or outside of the workplace, it is still a criminal offence. But criminal offences really only get activated or triggered when the police are notified and the police get involved and make an assessment that there's sufficient evidence to charge somebody. So that's the distinction between criminal and civil. We've also got what we call a different standard of proof, so different quality and quantity of evidence. That's my first circle. That's the smallest circle. That is mandatory. We expect people to act with appropriately at all times, right? And if they don't, then they can be held to account. The second circle, which some of you may remember, is our code of conduct. So all of your workplaces usually create a code of conduct. As you can see by the circle, a code is way bigger than what's unlawful, but it will always cover everything that's unlawful. In every code that I've looked at, I've always found that all of the things within that code fit within one of 3 different areas. So it's either about how people treat each other or how they treat themselves. So that's where you get fitness to work, your dress policy, hygiene, alcohol and drugs. Or it's about how they treat resources owned by their company or their organisation. Or it's about how they treat information that they come into contact with because of their work there. So that's your code. That's our second circle. You can hold people to account if they breach either of those 2 circles. Now, let's introduce psychosocial hazards, and you can, I feel like I almost want to find out, where do you think the shape should be? Because Jane and I spent a lot of time trying to work out this shape, and I don't know if I've got it right, but this kind of gives you a good view on it. So the psychosocial hazards, everything that's unlawful would be a psychosocial hazard. So in a little bit further down this talk, I'm going to show you the 20 categories that our WorkSafe have identified as being psychosocial hazards. Number 16 of those 20 is unlawful behaviours. So everything that's unlawful fits within that. When I was doing this circle though, not everything in your code fits within a psychosocial hazard. So as you would probably be aware, in your code, you will have things like conflict of interest. So I literally had someone that got, this is serious, like a true story, one of my clients, because she works in a pretty affluent job, one of their clients offered to buy her a BMW. Now, I haven't ever done that for my team. Don't expect that happening in the near future. Right? I know Jane's like, why not? But she can't say yes to that BMW because it's going to put her in a conflict of interest between her work duties and her personal. But that conflict of interest is not a psychosocial hazard. So there will be things in your code that will also be a psychosocial hazard, things within your code that are not. So that's why I've done the circle like that. And then psychosocial hazards is big. Actually, I think my circle probably should be off the page. But just because of the visual on it, I've made it within the screen that you can see. So that is where psychosocial hazards fit. It is broad. It's obviously a lot broader than unlawful behaviours. And we're going to be having a look at how broad it is in a minute. And then the last circle is our individual standards. So individual standards is how people think that life should be done, how people should treat each other. In an ideal world, so if you have a look at my circle of individual standards, which is a kind of a tealish colour, it doesn't completely cross over with unlawful and code of conduct. Now, why have I done that? And here's why. If it did completely cross over, which means that all of the people in your workplace never do anything that's unlawful or a breach of their code, then I would retire. I would retire and I would go and live in Italy because there would be no work for me to do. And also in HR, you would probably have a way more relaxed and stressless life. But the reality is that that's why we are doing what we're doing, is because people don't always realise. So I always think they either don't know or they don't care that what they've just said or done could be unlawful or a breach of your code. Think about individual standards, and you'll see there's a little bit on the right-hand side. There's lots of things that people aren't happy about that someone does, which are not unlawful and are not a breach of your code and are not a psychosocial hazard. And the tricky thing for that is that you still have a responsibility to help people learn how to navigate that. Now, we talk about that in our workshops, about teaching people to have curious, non-judgmental, I've noticed conversations. We're not going to talk about that today, but they are the 4 circles of behaviour. And I wanted you to see where I think psychosocial hazards fits within those circles to give you a bit of a framework that we're then going to go on to. All right. So in your workplace, you will be doing, some of you, but your employer, so your PCBU, will be doing a macro and a micro assessment related to psychosocial hazards. If they're doing a macro assessment, and I don't do this, but there is a global standard called the ISO 45003. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's not something that I use because that's not my space. But if your workplace has not yet done a macro assessment in relation to psychosocial hazards, then that is something that I would say you would be wanting to do. Where we work at EO Specialists is we help train up your managers and HR and anyone else in that space about how you identify and assess if something's a psychosocial hazard. And I call that on a micro level because I'm talking about on an individual level. So when someone comes to you and says, I'm not coping, how can you use these 20 categories around psychosocial hazards to work out what to do, how to identify it, how to support them? So that's really what we're going to be looking at. So safety is our framing up legislation. And again, I was like, okay, I was going back and having a look at it. So safety says, Section 18 of the Work Health and Safety Act talks about that an employer has to do all that's reasonably practicable to support the safety and health of workers while at work and to protect this health and safety. And so there's a 4-step process that they talk about, and the regulations actually talk about this 4-step process. And so the 4-step process, and again, many of you will know it, but I'm trying to frame this up for everybody, is you firstly identify the hazard, because remember, hazards is what can create risks. Once you've identified the hazard, then you're now looking at the risks that might follow because of those hazards. So now you assess that risk. You work out what controls you put in place to eliminate or minimize the risk. And then you've got a maintenance and a review. So the maintenance part is where you're keeping on doing what you were doing to minimize or stop that risk. The review part is where you're continually looking at it and going, has something new happened, something else happened? Is there something we have to do different now? In determining, so our focus at EO Specialists is in number 3. So all of the stuff around how do you eliminate or minimize the risk. But we have created some frameworks that and note-taking templates to help you do identify and assess. So again, I went and had a look at where this fits in, because in determining what controls or measures should look like, so when you're trying to work out what to do about number 3, then our regulations has something to say. And what I've literally done is just given you what the regulations say. So Division 11, page 77, and they basically say, here's some things that you need to look at when you're working out how to minimize or eliminate those risk behaviors. And I'm not going to go into that. I can send that through to you, but also literally just go to Division 11, page 77 of the Work Health and Safety Regulations, because all I've done is taken that from there. So if we go through our 4-step process, then the first step is to identify the hazard. Now, here is where your code of practice on psychosocial hazards in the workplace really is a gift for you, because they actually in the code step you through this 4-step process. All I'm trying to do is give you some visuals on it and maybe simplify it. But for those of you that really need to know, go back and have a look at the code. For the rest of you that need to be communicating it to other people, this might be sufficient. So step 1, which is identify, here it is. So these are the 20 categories that our WA Code of Practice have said are psychosocial hazards. Now, they did say in the code there could be others, but these are the ones that they've identified. And so what we notice from the categories is that there's quite a lot related to managers' responsibilities. So we think about number 1, poor leadership practices, work demands. So they're responsible for monitoring their staff work demands. Number 5, inadequate support or lack of constructive feedback. Number 6, lack of role clarity, so they don't actually know what they're doing. Number 7, if a manager is responsible or partly involved in the change management process. Number 8, low recognition and reward. Number 9, unfairness or inconsistency in the way policies and procedures are applied. So there's a lot in the space that managers are now responsible for. Can I say not just responsible for, because it's now identified as a psychosocial hazard. So that's greater than responsible, because there's a legal consequence, a potential legal consequence if they don't do it. And my experience of, we've been working in this space around workplace behaviours for the last 16 years, is that often managers are ill-equipped to be addressing this stuff. A lot of the ones that we've met have worked their way up the ranks, and now they're in some kind of supervisory or managerial role. They haven't been trained. And on top of everything else you've been asking them to do, they're now supposed to understand what psychosocial hazards are and what they're supposed to do about it. And I think it's a huge jump for them. And I don't think they can do that by themselves. So first step is identify. Now, here's what I have created, and you will get access to this. So we'll send this out to you. So I'm just kind of showing you a screenshot of it. I was thinking, look, if you're a manager and someone comes to you and says, I'm not coping, firstly, we want the manager to go, okay, wait a minute, that's a cue for me to go and have a caring conversation with them. But as I'm caring and listening to them, I need to be listening through the lens of psychosocial hazards. Are they not coping because of something that's happening in our work environment with our work people, that therefore we are directly responsible for under this framework of psychosocial hazards? Or are they not coping because of something that's happening in their personal life? So it's really important for a manager to be asking that question. Now, if it's their personal life, we've got a different script that we teach managers in our course. It's an I care conversational script. We always want to be caring for our people and supporting them. And so that's a different lens, framework, and action plan we have. Equally important, just different. Whereas if it's identified as a psychosocial hazard, they have to go through this 4-step process. And so literally all I've done is create a note-taking template. And actually, because it's pretty new, me creating it, even when I was reviewing it again today, I think I'm going to edit it before I even send it to you. So there's more changes I want to make. But let me at least walk you through what we've got at the moment. Step 1, identify that something's a psychosocial hazard. We've put the 20 categories there as a visual, and literally what your manager or safety or HR can do is highlight the ones that they think are a live issue as they're talking with the person about what's happening to them. So that's step 1. Step 2 is an assessment. So step 2 is where they now need to do things like, how serious is this risk? How likely is it to happen? What are the consequences if it does happen? How many people is it going to impact? What's the potential fallout? So I guess I've seen it with some of my clients that when they do this second step, they do like a color rating, right? So green is fine and no problems. Orange is we need to be aware. Red is danger zone. Also, some clients do like a number scale rating. So maybe 1 means we have no risk or it's minimal. 10 means danger, danger. We've got to do something pretty serious. So this is where, your when you're doing it on a whole of staff, you'd be doing that kind of color rating global. When you're doing it with an individual, then you'd be as their manager listening in for impact, what might happen if they don't do something, that sort of stuff. Step 3 is now about putting your controls in place. Now, what I did, and this is the bit I'm going to edit before I send it to you, I'm actually going to put back in, so let's go back for a moment. This slide here, where our regulations have said, here's what you need to look at when determining what controls to put in. I'm going to slip that into the point 3. At the moment, what I did was I kind of narrowed down those ones which I think your managers are most responsible for. But I actually think putting in the controls is a better option. Can I say, without a doubt, I mean, I have a team of 20 something people. One of the big commitments I made at the beginning of the year to my team was regular meetings with all of my direct reports. And I do think that is your best bang for buck. So when you're working with your managers, when you are working with eliminating or minimizing any of the behaviors that fit within those 20 categories, regular meetings with that person is so critical. It's not, of course, the only thing, but in that checking in, you get to find out what's happening, what's working, what's not working, how they're coping with their workload, have we got a risk around burnout and fatigue, and what are some measures we can put in place. So for me, regular meetings is just a not negotiable. But then what you want to do here is once you get to the point of because you're having this conversation with another human being who you've just identified have ticked off some behaviors that would fit within psychosocial hazards. And so together you work with them about how you start to minimize those behaviors continuing in the future. And so I've just put a few lines there because that's to trigger for them to make some notes, to brainstorm with that person. And then step 4 is your checking and your continuous audit. And so if it hasn't been resolved from doing step 3, then the manager has to go back to step 3 because it didn't work. You've got to keep on doing it until it does. And if it is working, then you're also meeting with them regularly to check in. Is there anything else? What's shifted? What's changed? How are they ticking along? It's not a complex note-taking template. I don't want to make things look really complex just to look really intelligent. I actually want to make things simple so that your people know how to use them. And this is one of the templates that we use in our one-day workshop for managing workplace behaviours that, of course, give them a much bigger framework on how to identify it. But that template helps them walk through the 4-step process. Identify, assess, put in your controls, do your check-ins and review on a regular basis. So that's exactly the same. So anyone that's in safety that's in the room as I'm talking, that's exactly the same framework you've probably been doing in safety for years around physical safety. It's exactly the same framework that they're asking you to do for psychosocial hazards. So I'm going to pause for a moment because in a minute I'm going to move on to legal consequences. So work safe and what they can do, how that impacts, and also some case law and just a bit of a sense of what's been happening in that space. So are there any questions, Jane or Claire, that have come up as I pause and have a drink of water?
So Franca, it's Jane here. At the moment, the only question we've got is, will we have access to the recording afterwards?
Okay, yes. So if you were in the room today, then there will be access. Yes, so we are recording it at the moment. It will be a limited access, and our request is generally that it's for your benefit, so not generally for people outside of the workshop today. But this is your chance. I'm pausing. Does anybody want to ask? You can come off mute and just ask a question, or you can type it in the chat box, because we've kind of really what I've done up to now is just gone through where does it all fit in with codes, regulations, what are they saying we've got to do? And so, and in a minute, I'm now going to say what's some of the consequences and how is this playing out in terms of prosecutions or other stuff.
We have one other question, Franca, and that is, would a restorative conversation between two staff members that have had conflict form part of a control measure?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. So unresolved conflict is under the Workplace Behaviours Code of Practice, is a risky behaviour. And under unresolved conflict, an employer has to show that they've done all that's reasonably practical to stop that conflict from continuing. And so, yes, a restorative, whether you use a mediator or you do it internal, a restorative conversation would be evidence. Here's what I've got to say, though. You've got to, because step 3 is do something to eliminate or minimize. So that would be the restorative conflict. Step 4 is to review and see whether or not that was successful or not. So step 3 is definitely valid. You just got to make sure you do step 4. Great. Anything else?
One, just to follow up on access to the recording, I have a few team members that could not attend due to illness. So I'm assuming that they were registered.
Yes.
Will they be able to access the recording?
Yes. So anyone that did sign up can, for sure. Yeah. And I think Kristen might have just come up with something related to outside. Hi, Kristen. Kristen's from the East Coast. Kristen from the East Coast.
Yes.
So what was that question?
So we have employees outside of WA. Can you comment on differences for other states? I'm assuming that's around psychosocial hazards.
Yeah. So look, I reckon let you and me have a chat outside of here if that's all right, just in terms of limited time. Every state and territory is a little bit different, and so yeah, probably not simple to have that conversation here. But broadly speaking, the definition of psychosocial hazards is the same. Our categories that I've identified are specific to WA, though there's nothing in those categories that would be surprising in terms of being a psychosocial hazard. It's more about the nuance of what a particular state or territory says in their regs, act or code. So I'm happy for you to reach out to me outside of this and we can have a chat. Anything else?
No, that's all the questions at the moment, Franca.
All right. So legal pathways. So I guess it's when I took a big picture back pretending I didn't know anything and hadn't read anything, and I wanted to go, all right, how can we get, as an employer, as a PCBU, because I'm a PCBU as well, how can we get in trouble in relation to this space of psychosocial hazards? And generally the way that happens is the framework, and again, this is WA, but there would be a similar provision in the other states and territories. And it's under WA, it's our Section 19, it's our primary duty of care. So usually when you look at a complaint or a WorkSafe investigation that's occurred, somewhere within their complaint and their languaging, they'll say something like, the PCBU failed to provide and maintain a safe workplace. So that's what in our legislation Section 19 talks about. So it's a very broad languaging when we're talking about failing to provide and maintain a safe workplace, of which psychosocial risks come under that. So if you didn't do all that was reasonably practicable to eliminate those psychosocial risks, then you will be held to have failed to provide and maintain a safe workplace. So that's kind of where it slips in. Under our work health and safety regulations is where they talk about psychosocial risks. So just trying to give you an understanding of how the pathway to end up being investigated by WorkSafe might come. It's throughout the primary duty outlined in section 19. Perhaps more importantly is kind of what could happen or what you need to be aware of. So we have this term, and some of you might know it, called notifiable incident. So a notifiable incident. Now I'm not going to, because there's a lot of different things that can tick off a notifiable incident. It has to do with serious risk of harm. It's also to do with death. But where it's probably most relevant around psychosocial risks is in relation to when someone takes 10 days off after the incident has occurred. And we're probably, again, much more aware of that around physical injury, may not be thinking about notifiable incidences in relation to psychological injury. Now, psychological could be for any of those 20 categories that we've talked about. And I've got to say, from the work that I'm doing in this space and the conversations that I'm having with people on a regular basis, burnout is very real. I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know. So burnout and fatigue is very real, but burnout, and when someone is at that point, then it's very possible that they could be taking more than 10 days of leave as a consequence of the incident. And I guess because burnout and fatigue by definition is a cumulative effect, I don't quite know when they define the incident, but my best guess is when that person goes on sick leave. So that's something that you need to be aware of as an employer, and because there's a legal consequence if you don't. So it's punishable with a fine if you don't notify them, and you need to notify them as soon as possible. So as soon as you know, you need to notify them. So it's just good to be aware about that. In terms of WorkSafe and their actions of what they can do, and again, some of you might know this, but they've got a few different things. So they can issue an improvement notice. So if a complaint is made or around psychosocial hazards, if WorkSafe decides that there's enough evidence or enough there for them to go in and conduct an investigation, they can go in and they can conduct that investigation. If you've ever experienced WorkSafe, they have very broad powers. So they can come in and basically say, we are doing an investigation in relation to psychosocial hazards. They don't tell you who's made the complaint. They don't generally give you much evidence, and they can ask you for whatever they want, and you must give it. If you don't disclose that information, that is also an offence which can be punishable by a fine. So they collect all this information. They then make an assessment about whether there's any psychosocial risks that are likely based on their investigation, and then they issue you with an improvement notice, which you must comply with. And generally, improvement notice has time specifications around that. They can also choose to prosecute. So once we get into prosecution, we're now getting into criminal space. So whereas an improvement notice and an investigation is a civil standard of proof, so balance of probabilities, is it more likely than not? A prosecution now is a criminal standard of proof, so beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's because in their prosecution, they can issue fines and they can issue imprisonment. So we're looking at really serious consequences that also can be under psychosocial hazards. I was having a look through. The most serious offence is in relation to what they call industrial manslaughter, which is someone loses a life as a consequence of a workplace incident. But I wanted to, that's less likely for most of us, but a category 1 offence where there's a serious harm or death. And so serious harm can definitely happen with psychosocial hazards. And there's a maximum imprisonment is 5 years and the penalty is $680,000. So just to give you a sense of that prosecution space and what is possible in that space. And then the last thing, which some of you may or may not know about, is there's this thing called enforceable undertakings. So enforceable undertaking is an alternative to imprisonment. It's something that the PCBU enters into with WorkSafe, Perhaps the one I'm most aware of, which was an enforceable undertaking, which was issued in December 2023, was with Fortescue, and they entered into an enforceable undertaking. They entered into an enforceable undertaking in the sum of $1.4 million. And so what an enforceable undertaking does is that money goes to in this situation, it went towards strategies to address inappropriate workplace behaviours in the mining industry. So Fortescue commits to that amount of money going into that parameters of what they agreed upon with WorkSafe. So an enforceable undertaking is an alternative to a prosecution. It means that obviously there's no criminal conviction that's occurred, and generally the money, so for example there, is way more than probably what they would have paid in a prosecution. But the aim is that it positively impacts the area that the prosecution would have happened in. So there are three different actions that WorkSafe can engage in. Just to give you any questions, Jane, before I go on and just talk about a couple of cases?
Yes, a good question here. Whether the scope of the Work Health and Safety Act and the regulations cover not-for-profit organisations and volunteers.
Okay.
I can answer that if you can't.
Yeah, go, Jane.
Yeah, so absolutely it does. The only organisations it doesn't cover is if everybody's a volunteer.
Yes.
The minute you have a paid employee, then the board or management committee become PCBUs and the regs apply.
Good. Thank you. Anything else? Any other questions?
That's the only other one that I can see at the moment, Franca.
Okay, great. So a couple of cases, and one where they clearly identified it was a psychosocial hazard, another where they didn't, but they talked about psychological harm. So the first case was Court Services Victoria, and this is kind of interesting because Victoria actually hasn't sorted out their psychosocial hazards code or whatever, but there was a prosecution that happened in Victoria in which they did actually identify a whole range of behaviours that fit within the space. And so this judgment came out, just trying to remember when it came out, I think it was in the last year or so, but it was for behaviours that occurred between 2015 to 2018. And it was everything from exposure to traumatic materials, so under psychosocial hazards, traumatic events and vicarious trauma and secondary trauma are covered. There was role conflict, there was high workloads and work demands. So work demands is another category under psychosocial hazards, and there were poor workplace relationships and inappropriate behaviour. So there's a whole lot of stuff that happened there. And unfortunately, one of the awful things that came out of that was that somebody died by suicide in the midst of all of that. They were fined $380,000 because, and this gets back to that broad cover-all term, because they failed to provide a safe workplace. They didn't adequately identify risks. So we go back to our 4-step process. They didn't do a risk assessment, and they didn't take care of the psychological health and well-being of their employees. So that's probably the most well-known case in the last couple of years. The second case about Whitlam, this was related to, so WorkSafe prosecuted it, but it was related to sexual harassment. And when you read it, it's quite interesting because actually what WorkSafe did is they prosecuted. So the individual, Mr. Whitlam, was the person that did the sexual harassing. And then he did the sexual harassing in 2 different cafes that he owned. So they prosecuted him, they prosecuted Cafe 1, they prosecuted Cafe 2, and he's now bankrupt. And in all of those 3, he was fined a total of about $250,000 for failing to reduce the risk of psychological injury to staff experiencing sexual harassment by a manager, which actually was him. So he was kind of all of those things. So even though it doesn't use psychosocial hazards or safety, it was in relation to psychological harm, and sexual harassment is category number 16, so it's an unlawful behaviour of one of psychosocial hazards. But just to give you a little bit of sense of what's happening, I think there will be more cases to come. So it's not rocket science for me to say that. We know in WA there's currently one that WorkSafe is in the midst of prosecuting. I just wanted to give you a few stats. We, up until now have been so focused on making sure we minimise physical injury, which is, of course, really, really important. But perhaps we're not so aware of the cost and price of mental health claims, and also in contrast to physical injuries. So these are some stats that came from it's called Key Work Health and Safety Statistics in Australia. And what they showed is that for people who had made a serious mental health claim, and I think this report was published in 2024, but it refers back to data from a couple of years ago. The median time off for people who had suffered a serious mental health claim was 37 weeks off work. And so my best guess is they probably suffered harm for a lot longer than 37 weeks, but that was actually the median time that they took off work. If we actually contrast that to the median time that people took off work for a serious physical injury, it was only 7 weeks. And when I saw this stat, to be honest, I was blown away. I had no idea that it would be such a high difference between the two. I probably would have thought it was a reverse of that. If we compare from a dollar value, then the median claim payouts for someone with a mental health claim was $65,000. The median for someone with a physical was $14,000. So from a numbers perspective, it also looks really different. And then PricewaterhouseCoopers did a report, a survey where they were looking at and the report's called, if you just literally Google PwC creating a mentally healthy workplace, then what they showed is that for every dollar invested in mental health programs, I've got to say, I frame it up by saying good mental health programs, the return on investment was $2.30. So from a numbers perspective, caring for your staff makes sense. From a liability perspective, caring from your staff makes really good sense as well. Before we finish, there's two things I want to do. Is I just want to almost just make a mention about, because psychologically, when people say I don't feel psychologically safe, and how does that fit in versus psychosocial hazards? But before I do that, because I know we're coming close to the end, is there any other questions, Jane?
One more question about access to the webinar, in that is, will we get a copy of the slides from today? The stats are interesting to refer back to.
Yeah, so anything that we think is useful, we will get to you in some kind of handout. I'm just trying to work out what that might look like. So psychological safety, look, the best definition for psychological safety that I could find, and as I reflected on it and thought about it, is that people feel safe to speak up without fear of repercussions. So I think it's both. You are creating an environment in which people feel safe to talk, but that safe bit is because they're not afraid that they're going to suffer some kind of detriment as a consequence. Now, that definition is different from psychosocial hazards. So I just want to be clear about it. It can also cross over, but it is not the same. They're not two circles that cross over each other exactly. Someone might feel psychologically unsafe. That has nothing to do with the stuff we've talked about, but also I hear employers say this to me now, that some people put psychological safety on the table as if, well, I don't feel psychologically safe, and so I'm not going to talk about this anymore. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, I'm very much like, you can't just chuck that on the table and therefore we shut down all conversations forever. And so it's really important. We do a play on psychosocial hazards, and we actually have a whole act. And in that act, someone says that I feel psychologically unsafe, and they storm off. And we actually talked with the whole audience. Okay, what was happening here? Did anything happen in that meeting that justified, was a valid justification for her saying that? And if not, then how do we want the manager to manage that? Now, for me, it comes from an I care space. Something happened to them that's upset them. Let's see if we can find out what. And then where what's happened to them was a psychosocial hazard, we need to take responsibility for it. Where what happened for them has nothing to do with a psychosocial hazard and has to do with other factors, then we need to help them navigate that. But we don't need to be afraid, in my opinion, when someone says, I don't feel psychologically safe. I think that's a great opportunity to say to them, tell me more. What's happening for you at the moment that makes you say that? So, and again, that stuff we train managers how to do, to get comfortable when someone says that, to not be afraid of asking the next question, to know how to ask that question, to know what the options are available to support that person, to not assume that you just can't say or do anything anymore because, you know, they've now put that word on the table. So I want to be really clear about that. Where to from here? Here's some things that I'm noticing, that I'm recommending, I'm saying that people should do. The first is psychosocial hazards is broad. It's a big circle. And I think we're still getting a handle on that, but think big and start talking to your people around those 20 categories. Get them to have their eyes over it and look at it and work out which ones are relevant within their team, their workplace, their people. It's not going away. But I reckon 2 years ago when it first came out, I read the Code of Practice and I was like, oh my goodness, is anyone else staying up late at night worrying about this like I am? I don't think anybody read it back when I first read it. So I want to be really clear, it's not going away. As I said, WorkSafe are in the midst of their first big prosecution in relation to it. And other states and territories have been doing them as well. So we need to get on board. We need to get our people on board. If you haven't done a macro assessment, you need to do one. It's not for me. We do know people that do them. And so if you want to know who does, have a conversation, just shoot us an email afterwards and we can let you know. Start training your managers, right? They are the ones that are going to see and hear. And if they have no idea about this stuff, they're not going to be listening to it. You need to tune their ears to listen out for stuff, because people aren't going to say, oh, I'm experiencing a psychosocial hazard. They're not probably going to say that. They're going to say stuff like, I'm not coping. And so you need your managers to start to tune their ears to go, when they say that, this is the lens that I'm going to listen to them through. And that's a workshop that we run. I'm sure there's other people that do as well, but you're more than welcome to find out about that. And safety and HR need to be talking to each other a lot, right?
So, Franca, there's a few more questions that have come in, so I just wanted to make sure we had time for those.
Right, let me finish this sentence and then I'll do them.
Yep.
So, safety and HR, you know what, historically, safety was over here and HR was over here. And if it was a physical issue, safety dealt with it. And if it was people and problems, HR dealt with it. You need to come together. I'm hearing workplaces where safety and HR are now sitting next to each other, where they're having group team meetings, where everything's coming in through a funnel and then they're working out, okay, you deal with that bit, we're going to deal with this bit. So I really do think safety and HR need to be talking to each other. And this is just, you know, when I was doing my snoop around the legislation, I came across this section and I was like, oh, look at that. So I did not know that you can be fined if you have not done adequate provision of training and instruction to your people. Maybe you did know that. I think training is important for so many reasons. Did not know that there was a penalty. So the person must ensure the information, training and instruction provided to a worker is suitable and adequate and also readily understandable by any person to whom it is provided. So look at that. Who would have known that there was a penalty related to training, which of course is a lovely segue into all of the work we do. If you haven't heard about our play on psychosocial hazards, it's a half-day workshop. All of our plays are interactive, they're fun, they're engaging, and there's lots of learning opportunities. This play is focused around those categories of psychosocial hazards, particularly how people treat each other. So we don't spend time in the play talking about loud noise or environmental conditions. We spend time in the play talking about anything that has to do with people and how they interact with each other, whether that's a manager or it's a peer-to-peer. So we'd love you if you want to find out more about that. Myself and Craig, who works with me, so tomorrow we'll be sending you out this content and some handouts, and then we'll be doing some follow-up phone calls. So if you want to talk with us sooner rather than later, shoot us an email. Otherwise, expect a call from us in the next couple of days. Okay, Jane, questions?
Yeah. So we have two around the 10 days absence. The first one, is the 10 days absence consecutive or just 10 days accumulated since and related to the incident? And the second is, if an employee takes 10 days or more of stress leave, is that a notifiable incident?
Yeah, so good question. Because I'm just going to see if I can, give me a second. So I'd written some extra notes in my look. Whoever asked that question, I'm happy for you to come back to me because I've made extra notes. I just can't find them at the moment related to a notifiable offence. It's not exactly clear, but it does look like it's got to be from the time of the incident that it's likely to be 10, and I think it's got to be consecutive days. And I would think stress leave, yes, and stress leave would fit within that. Remember, we go back to, is stress leave related to a psychosocial hazard, right? So you've got to connect, you've got to be able to connect the two. If they've got stress leave because of stuff that's happening in their personal life, well, it doesn't link back to anything that you're responsible for as an employer. So you need to be clear that there's a link back to your responsibilities. But I'm happy to give you some more content on that. Yep.
Great. Then we have, and I think this is going to be one that probably is an offline conversation, but what is traumatic material comprised of? Please provide examples.
Yeah, okay. Well, okay, I can give you some though. I used to be a criminal lawyer. I worked in the area of family violence. So I used to hear women tell me stories about violent incidences that had happened to them. That would be an example of me listening to or reading traumatic content. Which would trigger something called secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. So generally images, so there was a prosecution related to a female lawyer who was investigating child sexual offences, and she had to watch videos and read a whole lot of information related to those, what had happened to those victims. That's traumatic events. So think psychologists, think counsellors, think people who are dealing with people in crisis situations. So that's where it could trigger secondary or vicarious. What we call first responder trauma is more like police, firefighters, ambulance officers. So they are coming onto an incident where someone has suffered some kind of harm and they are observing that. So they are a first responder. So that's some examples of what trauma could look like.
Thank you. And last question is, what about situations where one employee is part of a crew who all perform the same work and says, for example, they are not coping with high workload, but is there someone who is less resilient than others?
Sorry, the sound went a bit weird just then, but are you saying there's a few people in the same crew, one of them's not coping, but everyone else is? Yeah. So the starting point is that then becomes an assessment about performance and required standards of work. So it may not be a psychosocial hazard. It may be that they are not operating at the standard required. And then there's a performance conversation and question that goes in that space first. So, yeah, there are times when it won't be a psychosocial hazard. It will be that they are not doing the job to the standard that's required. And that's where if you've got any other measures, like other people have done this volume of work, therefore it's reasonable to expect this person to do as well, that can be really helpful in making that assessment.
Okay, and that's all the questions. I'll just double check the chat, but I think we covered everything now.
All right. Okay, So just you'll get an email tomorrow. We'll try and get whatever useful information that we think is here to you. If you want to have a conversation with us about any of our training, but particularly with psychosocial hazards, please let us know. We have the next webinar, which is in 2 months' time, and that is on the brain chemistry of burnout, which is a lovely follow-on to this one, because we know that burnout is probably one of the biggest psychosocial hazards that's happening in workplaces. And so one of our staff, Charlotte Ellery, has done a master's in neurotransmitters. And so she does a fantastic presentation that talks through cortisol, dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin, what they are, how we can modify them in order to decrease the likelihood of burnout. And in fact, we are running that very workshop with a client tomorrow. So, but my brain is trying to find the date. Claire, someone have it on the top of your head when we've got our next?
16th of April, Franca.
So what date is it?
16th of April.
Thank you. Lovely. See, I did it right. 16th. Did you say 16th of April?
I did.
Lovely. There you go. It is there too. So 16th of April, we'll send you out that information for the next one. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I hope that this was useful. If you've got specific questions, please send them to me. Easiest email is franca@franca.com.au, but we'll get information out to you tomorrow. Go well, everybody. Take care.